What are some common challenges that orthodontists stuck in their practice face?
One is people pick locations that are overly saturated. They go into it and they're like, but I want to practice right next to where I live. But at the same time, I can promise you that if I'd opened the practice that I have where I live in the center of Houston with no growing communities, my practice would be a fraction of what it is today. People will also, they think that the way that they're doing it is the right way. They're gonna hire the marketing company, and before you know it, they've gone through like 3 or 4 marketing companies, but the one common denominator is them, and they don't look in the mirror and self-reflect. I decided, I'm like, okay, they're the experts. I knew how to straighten teeth. If I knew how to do marketing, I wouldn't be hiring you. And I'm gonna follow the guidelines and the steps that you're telling me to follow. If you implement the systems and the processes that you have, you will be successful. It's when you try to veer from that and think that you have a better way of doing it. I think maybe that's like, you know, the egotistical side of the orthodontist community.
Dr. Knecht, thanks so much for coming on the GrowOrtho podcast.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. So tell us just a little bit about your background and how you got started.
I became interested in becoming an orthodontist kind of college. I always thought I wanted to go into medicine. I was pre-med. I thought I wanted to be a dermatologist. And the guy that I was dating at the time, his dad was an orthodontist. And so I started spending time in his practice, and I was like, wait a minute, this kind of balances like the aesthetic side. There's still like an art to it. I really love it. And so I switched from pre-med to pre-dental.
And where'd you go do dentistry?
At LSU.
LSU. Okay. Are you an LSU fan?
I am an LSU fan.
Okay. Football season, I think, is starting Saturday.
It is.
Technically, it started because I guess it started last week, but the main games the real games are this Saturday. So that's cool. My wife's like, her whole family's like Alabama, Roll Tide.
Oh, man.
And then my granddad went to Auburn before it was called Auburn. It was called I don't know, it was like a technical school. So my whole side of the family's Auburn, and then my wife's side is Alabama, but I don't really care. I'm like, we'll just watch football and see who wins. So you went to LSU, then where'd you do your residency?
I went to UConn for residency.
What was that like?
It was very cold, quite an abrupt change. It was very eye-opening to leave the South, but I felt like if I didn't leave and I stayed in Louisiana for my residency too, that I would never get out and experience the world. Yeah. So at the end of residency, I'd gone through a divorce, and I kind of had to figure out like what my next step was and what my next move was. So that's how I ended up in Houston. Yeah.
How did you start in terms of working within orthodontics? Where did you start?
So I started working for Pacific Dental, which is a DSO. They offered, a great starting pay for somebody that was just coming out of school. And I figured it would be great to not have to worry about any sort of overhead or running a practice. All I had to do was figure out how to do the ortho, essentially. And I did that for about 3 years. And then I was starting to feel like, okay, this is great, but I was making good money compared to being poor in residency and having zero income. But you start to plateau. You can only do so much. They limit the number of your chairs. You don't have any autonomy in terms of staffing and who your treatment coordinator is. And that would get really frustrating because I would go to one office and crush it. And it was partly related to the treatment coordinator. And then I would go to another one and my production was terrible. So I started looking at other options, and I was approached to do an associateship, which only lasted 6 months because I realized that wasn't the right fit either. And I would just never be happy unless I opened my own.
So we actually met, was it 2018 or was it 2019? It was at AAO.
I think it was 2018.
I think it was. And that was LA?
It was.
Yeah. So I was walking around with Dr. Feldman, and he's like, hey, I'm going to introduce you to some people. And I think Thomas was there too.
I'm sure he was.
Every time I see you at some event, it's like you and Thomas. At that time, HIP was pretty small, but we had already started our footprint within orthodontics. And I think you and I talked, but it wasn't until maybe several months later, or maybe even almost a year, where we actually started to work together and did your branding, that type of thing, branding website. And I don't think we actually started to work together in a marketing capacity until 2020 when COVID hit. And that's when you were opening, right?
Correct. So I opened my practice 6 weeks before the whole world shut down.
Good timing.
Yeah. Great timing.
At least it was right before.
Honestly, looking back, it was great timing because I didn't have all these patients in treatment that I had to worry about. But at the time when I just spent my life savings opening a practice, it didn't feel like a good time.
Yeah. But it ended up becoming the best time for ortho. And so that was huge for you in terms of a launch pad to be able to open. Who would have known that would have been the best time? But it ended up being the best time. So you started with us and that was in a capacity that we don't even have anymore, the bridge. Then it kind of rolled over to our full framework. And what has life been like? Like going back to opening, what was it kind of like in the early days through COVID and, the next year and a half? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So when I first opened, it was pretty painful coming from, working at a busy DSO, even working as an associate where you show up and you have this really full schedule of patients. And then I open my own and I'm literally sitting there waiting for the phone to ring.
Yeah.
And of course you have staff. You've got to pay them and make sure that you keep them. And the phone would barely ring.
Yeah.
We had so much free time on our hands. It was honestly scary. And that's when I'd kind of decided, I gave that a few months and that was pretty much all I could take. I don't know how people tough that out any longer, honestly.
Yeah. It's pretty scary. Yeah.
It is. And so I just felt like the sooner that I could grow my practice, then the quicker that I could get out of the DSO job that I had. So I was splitting my time 50-50 at the time. And I knew that if I kind of went all in with the marketing, then that would just help me, grow my my private practice and go full time there. And I waited through the end of the summer. That was kind of my timeline because all my friends that had practices at the peak of the summer when things were opening back up, they were really starting to do well again. And so I was like, okay, let me see I don't really know what my baseline is because I opened for 6 weeks. I closed. Then I reopened and it was just such a weird time. But I couldn't even get general dentists in the area to let me in their office. They would want to have a Zoom call because it was still like the height of COVID kind of, and people were scared. They were like, you can't
wear
come in.
Wear your hazmat suit, put on 4 masks.
You can't come in and have lunch and bring my office lunch, but I'll schedule a Zoom call with you.
Yeah.
And it's just hard when you can't get in front of people. You can't really, get to know them or talk to them. Why are they going to refer to me versus the office that they were referring to, for years?
Right.
And that's when I talk to people all the time that are asking me about marketing, even with a startup, that to me is key because you just need people to get in the door. You can then establish the relationships with the general dentist by following up with their patient that came to you from an ad.
Yeah.
And then say, hey, I want to talk to you about this treatment plan. I saw one of your patients. And then the more you start to do that, the more they like your cases. And then before you know it, they're referring to you instead of the other guy.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. I think a lot of people don't think about it that way. When you started, because a lot of people have this question, how many people do I need to hire? So what did that look like with you? When you started, how many team members did you first have?
My situation was a little different. I had 3. So I only had one that was full-time. That was Vanessa. So she was essentially my front office, TC, office manager, insurance. She did everything at the front. And I had 2 assistants that I brought with me for my corporate job. So I pretty much told them that I will quit if you don't let these assistants just follow me wherever I go. Because that was what they were doing at Pacific Dental.
Right.
So they ultimately worked only with me in whatever office I was working at.
Okay.
So that's, maybe not the best thing you're not supposed to steal staff. But at the end of the day, they believed in me and wanted to work with me.
Right.
And from the corporate side, I produced a lot of money for them. And so it's cheaper for them to not have turnover.
Right.
And it's a lot easier for them to replace 2 ortho assistants than it is an orthodontist.
Sure. Yeah, totally.
So they just kind of looked the other way.
Right.
I'm not telling everyone to go and steal
but maybe negotiate, if you can.
But it's definitely something to consider. Or I know people that have hired someone in their private practice and brought them with them to a DSO. and pretty much said, like, this assistant works with me part-time. Can they follow me here? And then the DSO is paying them.
Yeah. So I think the key piece is, obviously you worked at a DSO for a while, and so you had some reserve built up, and then you continued to work at the DSO, so you didn't have to live off of what your practice was producing. They're not necessarily a right or wrong, but you definitely went about it in a smart way where some people may come out of residency and want to just go private practice. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. I commend them for wanting to do that. In today's climate, it's really, really tough because everything just costs so much money. So if somebody just pays full price for everything, they could come out $800,000 in debt. I think that's like the highest, and then it's like from there, let me go open and take out another loan and work with a different, obviously that's not student loans anymore. So you're working with a bank, and you may have to take out anywhere from $500K to $1 million, depending on the building, the build out. If you want all the fancy bells and whistles, 2 iTero scanners, et cetera. I think that's really key because you want to set yourself up in a position where you can actually win and flourish and do well, So that is really cool that you were able to go about it that way. What was it like in terms of your build out? You don't have to get specific, but like cost and like, how did you budget? What was your budget? How did you think about that? And who did you work with in regards to maybe finance, planning, interior design, location? What did that look like?
So in terms of kind of the finance and planning everything out, I did most of it myself. My dad was a business owner, so
that helps.
I definitely got a lot of great tips from him. But I figured out essentially what my practice loan was going to be. I knew that wasn't going to be enough. I had a certain amount saved. And then I figured out some loopholes with extra equipment loans. So like, for example, you could finance like your scanner, pan-ceph, sterilization from Benco.
Okay.
And then that was separate from my Bank of America loan.
Got it.
And I found that out from like an equipment broker. So he kind of gave me some good tips on loopholes and how people would get extra funding.
Yeah.
Because Bank of America usually only gives you about $500,000.
Okay.
And my construction cost was $350, and this was pre-COVID, so that was honestly cheap.
Yeah, it's like double that now, if not more. Yeah.
And you get tenant improvement if you're leasing a space, but you don't get that money back until after you have the CO. So I got $75,000 back, but you have to have that money up front.
Yeah. You started obviously the practice still working at a DSO, and then was it you mentioned this, but what was it about a year or that you worked at the DSO still part-time in some capacity?
Correct.
Okay.
I thought it was going to take me a lot. I'd budgeted when I had all my planning. I thought it was going to be a 2 to 3 year plan.
Right.
And that's where, honestly, I feel like without your partnership, it easily would have taken me 3 years. I think where I got to in a couple of years, I was predicting to take 5 years.
When did you start to realize, okay, this could happen a lot sooner? Was it pretty early on once we kind of jump-started everything?
Yeah, I think in the first month that we did the bridge, I went from doing 10 starts a month to 20.
Yeah. So doubled basically production.
Overnight.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
So you started to think, okay, the runway for this is going to be a lot shorter than I anticipated, which was a great thing.
Yeah.
Then once you went all in, how did you continue to grow? Like, what did that look like in terms of, okay, now we're a year in, I'm going to leave the DSO, go full time. How did the team change and how did the growth change?
Once I went all in, the growth was pretty quick. It was a pretty stark difference about once I was kind of devoting all of my time pretty much to my practice. And I just had more availability for consults. Instead of saying like, oh, Dr. Knecht's only here on, Monday and Wednesday. Now we were giving 4 days of options.
Yeah. And then you got married, obviously.
Yeah.
Like
a year ago. Right around a year ago. And
so what did that look like also juggling all of that, being a business owner? How did that go?
Honestly, it was a little hectic last year, but even despite taking off tons of time to like go and scope out the wedding venue, get married in Europe, I still was up from the year before. And last year I worked the least number of days since I'd ever started practicing. And it was my highest production yet. And I think I'm on the same trend. I'm definitely working less now. And my production's up 20% from last year.
Wow. And then last year, what was it up in terms of percentage comparatively to 22?
It was only up maybe 10%.
Okay.
But the climate, I mean, in ortho wasn't that great either. Like a lot of people were down 10%.
Yeah, and still are even this year. We did a podcast with Gage recently, and I think they shared that large practices are down somewhere between 3 to 5%. And then smaller practices are down, or was it the opposite? I can't remember, down like 10%. Yeah, anywhere from that 3% to 10%. And then I think summer pretty much brought it back to break even, but still most people are not growing, but you are. And there's a lot of factors. We can kind of break down some of those. Let's kind of dive into your approach to treatment, because I think that's pretty fascinating. And a lot of things that you're starting to do, there is a buzz in the industry about. I don't see a lot of people doing it well. So I'm really curious on how you're treating patients. And I hardly get into this because I can only go so deep myself, in the whole clinical realm.
Yeah.
But for viewers, listeners, what does that look like? How do you approach orthodontics?
So one of the biggest things that I've really started paying attention to is Airway. And I know that's a controversial topic and place in ortho, but I've worked really hard to kind of develop a team. So I don't just approach ortho as just one piece. So when I'm explaining that to the patient, and I do a lot of phase 1, a lot of expansion, but I'm still referring them to other healthcare providers as well to fully, treat the patient. So I'm looking at it as treating the patient as a whole, not just treating their teeth, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
And then, the other big piece that I've done is I've gone to indirect bonding, and I use KLON's bracket system, which has been amazing because once you get to a certain level, it's hard to, everyone always says, like, I don't want to bring on all this marketing and have all this growth. And then how do I maintain the quality of care? And I think that's fair. Like that was a thing that I was questioning too. And with indirect bonding, you're doing the plan on a computer and then the assistants are, placing the indirect bonding trays. So I can easily, do multiple bondings at a time and know that the quality is not decreasing. If anything, it's more accurate because I did the setup on the computer. So it's allowed my practice to grow tremendously, but without sacrificing quality at all. I think if anything, my cases are looking better now than they were 2 years ago.
That's amazing. And there's a lot of options out there now for indirect bonding. Why do you like KLON specifically so much?
So there's several. To me, it's really the only way to go in the indirect bonding world. So you have a semi-custom bracket system, which I like. So that's the difference. You can use, for example, like Dibs AI, and you can put any bracket that you want, but it's not using a custom or semi-custom bracket. So I like that KLON's semi-custom. And then if you compare that to Lightforce, where I don't want all my patients in ceramic brackets, I don't like ceramic brackets. And I don't know many orthodontists, honestly, that love working with them. So to me, KLON was the perfect in between. Like it's not fully custom like Lightforce. It's still semi-custom. You have the benefit of the indirect bonding. And you also have a backstock of brackets, which to me is the biggest issue with Lightforce. So if you don't reorder that bracket and a patient breaks it and your assistant forgot to reorder it, the patient might come back and you don't have a backup. And that's not a very good look. And it's just not, efficient. I care about efficiency. And so now we have way less brackets that we actually have to stock. It's like this little pill box. And my lead assistant just checks that weekly and we order, as needed, but we don't really have to keep more than 5 backup brackets. And, it's still traditional metal, but they also have self-ligating for someone that wants self-ligating. They've got ceramic. So you have, to me, it covers all of the different bracket types, but then also the price point. So it's
more
half,
affordable.
It's half the cost of Lightforce. And, I would argue that it's just as good.
Right. You had sent me a book, and I think this book was part of your journey with Airways and kind of tweaking how you're doing things. What was the book?
So the book was Breath by James Nestor. And his whole, concept, or like the intro into it, is pretty much he does this experiment where he turns himself into a mouth breather. It's him and this other guy, and they go through all this like rigorous testing, and the effects that it has on their body are insane. And so imagine if you've got these young kids and patients coming in that are mouth breathing, how much is that stunting their growth and development? And why aren't we paying attention to that, as an orthodontist that focuses on the mouth? And we see things, honestly, we're looking inside the mouth. And that's, I think, what really triggered me. Pediatricians aren't looking at the oral cavity the way an orthodontist is. So why not try to recognize some of these things and have a difference that has a more profound effect on a patient's life than literally just straight teeth?
Yeah. What does that look like practically? I mean, I'm assuming that you're treating people a lot younger. You're building a treatment plan for them, which may include a team of other providers.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things is I upgraded my PANCEF to a CBCT. So that was a really nice thing about Vatek, which was the company that I went with. They'll do a complete buyback.
Oh, wow.
So after 3 years, and I got mine extended because I opened in COVID, so I just told them I needed more time. And they bought back my PANCEF for exactly what I paid for it.
Wow.
And then I just paid the difference.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And you were even talking to me about like skulls and how the jaws change. I mean, I know that we hear this because I even hear this stuff, but how are orthodontists thinking about, do they know all this stuff that you were telling me? Do they know what's going on and know how they can affect that within their practice?
I definitely think yes and no. It's just not something that's taught in school. And I never learned about any of this in residency.
Oh, wow.
And I don't think that it's in a lot of the residency curriculum now. I never knew what a myofunctional therapist was, or they didn't talk to us about tongue tie releases or the importance of, early treatment and how it can affect, breathing and all of that. So it's stuff that I've had to really seek out. There are some really amazing, orthodontists that are outspoken in the space, but there's still a ton of people that really don't like this. And they'll say, oh, we don't have enough evidence to support it. When the reality is there's tons of evidence around expansion and how expanding, broadens the floor of the nose, which ultimately is going to help you breathe better.
Right.
And you have a more profound effect if you're treating younger kids. Everything is more pliable.
Right.
So why do we want to wait and watch until they're 12 when things are more fused together?
For you, did you start to see other orthodontists doing this and you were doing your own research? Were you starting to see things in your practice and saying, okay, something's not right here? I'm sure it was a combination.
Yeah, it was definitely a combination. And it was more along the lines, like I used to do a lot of expansion to help prevent the canines from getting stuck. And I was doing that younger and younger and noticing that when I did that, I didn't have to deal with canine impactions, which are they're costly for a practice because you have to see that patient a ton. So they're never, procedures that you make very much money on. So if I was seeing ways that would prevent that, I'm like, why? One, it's way better for the patient. But then two, it's just so much more efficient. And I was realizing that I was hardly having to expose and I was rarely ever extracting when I would really expand and expand early. And so that kind of, once I started reviewing all of my cases, which could happen more once I was in my own private practice, because when you work for a DSO, you kind of move around. Like I would never stay in the same office for a long time.
And I'm assuming you're kind of tied to their limitations in terms of how you can treat to some degree.
To some degree. Like they definitely give you pretty full autonomy. And I don't think, like they never dictated, said you can't do phase 1 or do a lot of phase 1. They let me treat however I wanted to treat. But it was more just that, one, I was still just learning how to do private practice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's not really something that they prepare you for in school.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden they just turn you loose and like you're the one that has to make all of the decisions.
Yeah.
So I was kind of just sticking to exactly the way that I was taught and what I knew. And to me, it took time before I could start to form my own opinions and look at things kind of more objectively and say, wait a minute, why am I saying just wait and watch? Like, what if I could have an impact earlier on that would have a better effect on the total outcome?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I kind of started diving into it with my own research, going to CE courses, taking online courses.
I kind of want to send my kids to you. May fly to Houston. And, all right, we're going. I actually just had my tongue tie lasered with Dr. Carter in Mobile. That was interesting. Of course, my wife is like into all this. She does all the research. And so my kids had their tongue tie lasered when they were a couple weeks old. My daughter had a tongue tie and lip tie, and then my son just had a tongue tie. But it's also, I never had like tongue mobility. And to see my son, you know, before he was a year old, like flip his tongue and do all these things I'm like, how do you do it? Like, that's crazy. But it shows you how things should function, you know, and obviously I'm not going to improve like a child would who had their tongue tie lasered, but I don't know. We'll see. There are some interesting articles and there's some interesting studies about adults who have more relief in terms of neck pain, tightness, releases the fascia. So we'll see. Crossing my fingers.
There's a ton of research on that. So the ENT that I work with does a lot of like buccal tie releases. And he's developed this very interesting method where you can literally like press on the frenum, and it's pretty wild. If it needs to be released, if you like press it against the bone, turn your head certain directions, you'll notice that the tension's relieved. And so that's kind of like a diagnostic criteria that he's figured out on if he needs to release it or not, because
That's
of all the
pretty
fascial
cool.
connections. It's
Yeah.
really interesting.
It is.
And the more you start to look into it, it's really hard to just kind of turn the other way because it makes sense. So ultimately, from like a growth and development standpoint, that's why releasing everything so young helps, because the tongue helps to shape and form the palate. So if it's restricted, you always see this like narrow vaulted palate. And that's how like I can look at the palate and almost see that the tongue's tied.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Like it all
is.
tells a story, and I always have said that ortho's like a puzzle. Like the teeth have to fit together a certain way.
Right.
And there's this like ideal way that every case should finish. And I feel the same way about Airway. Like once you start looking at all the pieces, like they all fit. And it makes a lot of sense.
I kind of want to send you all my images and just see what you think.
Get my thoughts.
Yeah. It is fascinating. And what's really cool about what this could do for orthodontics and specific orthodontists like yourself is you're looking at things holistically, like how they should be. And it's almost like functional health within orthodontics. So maybe there'll be, and I don't want to get into like the biodentist, you know, because there are some cool things that they're doing too. And a lot of what they're saying does make sense, but it can also kind of get into conspiracy theory land, you know, with certain things that they do. But I do commend them for trying to look at things in a more natural way than, oh, we have like a quick fix, you know? And I think all of healthcare should start to look at things that way, because we've seen what happens when you just throw the Band-Aid at it. You know, and in medicine, that's usually medication and, you know, we'll just cut on you and, you know.
That was part of my journey too, is that's how I view medicine. And I feel like we should be looking at like everything from a preventative standpoint. And that was the other like aha moment with some of the Airway stuff for me is when I was reading the book Outlive. And I was like, wait a minute, why? Like if I think about an extraction case, like it's not really addressing why we have crowding or what the root problem of the whole issue is. It's like, let's just put a Band-Aid and fix it and make the teeth look pretty. And you're not thinking about, are there any repercussions for doing that? And I'm not trying to like get into the extraction, non-extraction dilemma, because I still believe that extractions are needed in cases.
Sure.
So like, I'm not like that far off the rails with it, but it's still, there's things that we should be looking at more holistically or earlier on that, you know, have a more profound effect on the well-being of the patient.
Yeah. And you mentioned data, and there's a lot of data if you go look for it. I think that's kind of like anything. Whatever you want to find, you can find depending on what side you're on. But what are you seeing in your practice with patient outcomes since you've started this approach?
It's honestly been a huge practice builder because I've had parents that are honestly reporting on like behavioral changes and that their, kids are sleeping better. So they're not acting out as much. They're not as wild and crazy anymore. And so those are the parents that are like talking, and people are coming to me saying now, like, oh, I heard that you pay attention to this. Like, can you check my kid for, potential airway issues? And I've had people driving an hour away because, a dentist in a neighboring town was like, she's the only one I know that's looking at this. Like, you need to go to her.
I feel like too, moms know when something is wrong with their kids. They're so in touch. Like my wife will be like, did you notice it? I'm like, what are you talking? Like, they're just in tune with what's going on because they've always been connected to the child. And so they're looking for stuff like this. I feel like within the mom's community, this stuff probably starts to catch like wildfire, because for the moms noticing this, like, my kid is a mouth breather, and I'm on the internet and I'm reading, or I'm in this Facebook group, and, now I hear people talking about adenoids and tonsils. And it seems like that was not the case definitely when I was a child.
It wasn't. And same thing for me. Like, my sister and I kind of grew and developed very differently. And 100%, like, she's been a mouth breather her whole life. She had large tonsils and adenoids. She had all of these symptoms. And then into her adult life, she's had constant like neck and shoulder tension, which they say is like due to posturing because you're trying to open up your airway. Like, all of these symptoms that I never had or never experienced. And it's just wild to see that, like, my mom was always like, we did the exact same thing with you. I don't know what happened.
Sorry.
And I've seen it on patients, and that's what's really eye-opening. Like, I can show you this one particular family that one girl had tonsils and adenoids taken out really young, has like a beautiful profile, developed very normally. The other girl did not have the tonsils and adenoids taken out and had airway problems, but they had moved and weren't able to bring her to the same ENT. And her profile is profoundly different. And she's constantly sick. Like, there's definitely so much more going on.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's the only thing that caused it, but it's definitely, there's known links between, and that's been well, studied in the ortho literature, that it's called adenoid facies. And it's been well documented that the mandible kind of rotates down and back if you have large adenoids and you're a mouth breather. And we've known this for years and years.
It's crazy.
But yet we'll still just look at that patient and say like, oh, let's put you on a recall. You don't have all your permanent teeth yet. We'll see you back, in 12 months.
Well, it makes so much sense. And, I'm into biohacking, but one of the biggest things they talk about is breath work. And actually, I was at a retreat in Miami. This was 2019. And it was with like 20 guys, and they flew a guy in just to do breath work. And it was for an hour long. You all lay down in the grass, flat on the back, close your eyes. He played some songs, sounding super woo-woo. But he leads you through group breath work, and just the breathing, you're really trying to get that belly breathing like a child. And it is fascinating that you can see a child breathe that way, like just watching them sleep, you can see that belly breathing. And then also with a lot of musicians, you're breathing from your diaphragm, like down here versus most of us breathe up here in our chest. So anyways, walking you through that, and he may work with a certain person for a couple minutes or seconds. And just due to the sensation of like oxygenating your body for a solid hour like that, people started to like cry. Not that they wanted to cry. It was just some type of result of almost like euphoria or feeling good because they were actually breathing properly, so it makes a lot of sense with what you're saying, but also in tandem with just how as a society and humans, most of us aren't breathing like we used to, because just like our jaw and structure is changing because we're not ripping food apart, we're not running or walking long distance, we're not doing any of those things that would require that type of breathing. So it is kind of fascinating just to look at breathing and breath work and what that does as a whole, for health.
You really have to read this book.
Yeah.
Breath.
I want to read it.
He goes on like all sorts of breathing retreats, like you're talking about. And he kind of walks through this like journey and kind of when it started for him. And he went to this like breathwork class and he said that they tell him to close his eyes. And once he opens at the end of the class, he's literally like drenched and like dripping in sweat. And he's like, I just sat here and, breathed for an hour. Like, what the heck happened? And so he goes on this whole journey of, different techniques and how the mouth breathing affects you and all of that. So it's very interesting.
Okay, switching gears for now. We may come back to this. What do you see within the industry where most private practice orthodontists maybe kind of go the wrong way or think about things the wrong way, and the result of that would be their practice isn't growing? Do you see any kind of common links with that? And where I'm going with this, just to preface it, is we see a lot of orthodontists in private practice who are stuck. And of course, it's frustrating. It's painful. And they can't seem to figure out how to get to the next level, even sometimes with help. So I'm just curious your perspective on that.
I think there's a couple things. One is people pick locations that are overly saturated. They go into it and they're like, but I want to practice right next to where I live. And that's great.
Downtown LA.
Yeah. And that's great. But at the same time, I can promise you that if I'd opened the practice that I have in Montrose, where I live, in the center of Houston with no growing communities, that you're landlocked, like the only houses that are built or new houses that are built are teardowns of an old one, my practice would be a fraction of what it is today. You have to go to an area that has continuous growth and influx of families, because I also live in an expensive area of Houston. So people move out of that area when they have kids.
Right.
That's where they'll live, maybe in their 30s. And then they're like, oh, I want to have a couple of kids. The schools are more expensive. So let's move to the suburbs where we can send them to public school and have a house that's just as big and costs half.
Yep.
And so that was huge for me in choosing a location. I went into it thinking yes, I'll commute, but I know where I want to get in terms of practice level. And so I was very strategic about the location. And I think that that's a mistake a lot of people make. And they're like, well, I'm stuck. I can't get past the $1 million mark. I'm like, well, there's just only so many people, and you're in a saturated area with a practice on every other corner.
So think about it like this. Let's just say you want to go to New York City, Fifth Avenue, and open a orthodontic practice. Okay, cool. I lived in New York, cool city. Probably would never live there again, but it's cool, cool place. How much advertising and marketing dollars are spent in New York compared to the outskirts of Houston, like a little community? I just want people to think about this. It's like 1,000 times more. You're competing with all the big brands. Everyone is trying to advertise within New York City. And so there is a lot more noise and a lot more competition. Same thing with LA or Austin, Texas has become the new Austin. LA. And you really have to think over your desire to live in a specific place. First and foremost, I am now a business owner. That's the first thing. If you decide to start a business, I hate to break it to you. You are a business owner. And so a business owner should want their business to be profitable, because if it's not, then guess what? You're not in business. All of this sounds so simple, but I think a lot of orthodontists don't really think about it. They think, obviously I'm super specialized. I want to go into private practice. I should be able to kind of open wherever and make it work. And it sounds great. It just doesn't actually work that way, And so if you're thinking about the competition of where can I spend advertising dollars as a small business, most of our partners are spending somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000 a month in ad spend. Think about that in LA. Companies are spending $100,000 a month, $1 million a month. And how are you going to compete? Now, there's exceptions to everything. You know, we have people around LA that are successful, but it was a different path. And if you have options, you should really think about this, you know? So I do think that yeah, it's not thought about enough in a strategic way.
Right. I think people just, they think like, okay, if I build it, they're going to come.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to live here, so I'm going to open my practice right next door. And I think that everyone also has different like goals and aspirations. So like if your goal is to have a practice that you work at a few days a week and you want a family and you want to get to, 1.5, I think that's very doable.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just like ride that wave and like you're perfectly happy doing that. But if you want to have more growth than that, you have to go to an area that's growing.
Mm-hmm.
But, everyone doesn't want the same thing. So some people want to just be an associate, and that's fine too. And there's also providers that don't want the same amount of growth that I want.
Right, totally.
And it's all fair. It's also about like being true to yourself and figuring out at the end of the day what's going to make you happy. And if I was like struggling to continue to beat my previous months, I wouldn't be happy. I'm very competitive with myself,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like to feel like I'm stagnant. So I knew that going in. So to me, it was like, okay, I need to pick a suburb. I'm going to have to drive. And I also like the idea of being a big fish in a little pond.
Mm-hmm.
Where I can go in and make a much bigger impact. You can get involved with the schools and you're like the one sponsoring everything. And
Mm-hmm.
everyone knows you and you're a household name and everyone goes to you. And I would much prefer to be that person and like the expert in that community that everyone goes to and trusts than in the middle of Houston where, nobody really knows who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just too noisy and really hard to stand out as a small brand. And for those listening who are like, okay, well, where's the best place to go? I mean, what we're seeing is really everywhere from Texas, with the exclusion of, Austin. I would probably not open a practice there if it were me. I mean, it's just become so saturated and so competitive, which I'm sure is good for the city in a lot of ways. But as a small business, I just wouldn't do it. But the Texas all the way over southeast, and then once you get into the northeast, it kind of changes again, and then Midwest, Utah, Oklahoma, those are some really great areas too. What we're seeing is it definitely is like these communities over cities. You can go in and it's just easier. It's kind of like a hack, so I always tell people, hey, if you want to live in a city, and you live in a city,
yeah,
but like you said, you didn't open a practice there. So I think it can be pretty simple just working like that versus like, oh yeah, you need to avoid Houston altogether. Like, no, you live there, but you're strategic about where you open. And
I like having my personal and professional life separate.
Yeah.
Like I like going out and going to dinner with my husband and we're not running into like patients and parents, and it's nice to just have like a separate life. Like here's my work life, here's my personal life, and they don't overlap.
Mm-hmm.
I'm perfectly happy with that.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so location, that's a good one. What else? What else do you see? Maybe like a false belief or something holding them back?
I think people will also, they think that the way that they're doing it is the right way. So they're going to hire the marketing company, because a lot of people will say like, we were talking about this a little bit.
Yeah.
And before you know it, they've gone through like 3 or 4 marketing companies. But the one common denominator is them. And they don't look in the mirror and self-reflect. And I mean, I have to admit, even when we were going through all of the training, I was like, you want me to have my team follow up with leads how many times? This is insane. I'm going to drive them crazy.
Right.
And it wasn't until, I'll backtrack. I decided, I'm like, okay, they're the experts. I knew how to straighten teeth. If I knew how to do marketing, I wouldn't be hiring you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to follow the guidelines and the steps that you're telling me to follow. And I think that so many people will hire you, or they hire a different company, but they're like, but I still know how to do it the right way, or we're going to do it my way. When in reality, they should be following all of those steps. And if you implement the systems and the processes that you have, you will be successful.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you try to veer from that and think that you have a better way of doing it. I think maybe that's like, the egotistical side of the orthodontist community.
Yeah.
But I think that that's a really big kind of pain point for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear it all the time when I talk to people and they're calling me for, oh, hey, I want to hear about your experience with hip.
Yeah.
And they all get so hung up on the offer and how many times they have to call.
Yep.
They're like, I don't want to be a salesperson. And, I was telling them that it wasn't until it's not that I didn't buy into it at first. I did once I really started to see the results.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't like Harrison and I always laugh about this story. And this is when I now tell this to my staff when I hire new staff and I'm like encouraging them to do this. I was like, I wanted an alarm system. And I signed up and filled out this thing. Do you know how many times they had to call me before they got me on the phone and I purchased the alarm? Like 5 times, because they would call me and I was busy.
Mm-hmm.
But it never bothered me. I didn't listen to the voicemail because I knew that
I do the same
I knew
thing.
what voicemail they were leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And so they happened to just call when I was free.
Yep.
And then I was like, oh yeah, actually I need that alarm system and I have time. And then, I buy the $5,000 alarm system.
Mm-hmm.
But that's when, and now I tell that to my staff. And so I tell them, I'm like, they clicked on that lead because they wanted orthodontic treatment. The reason they haven't picked up is it's just not an opportune time. It doesn't mean that they're not interested. So you have to keep following up with them.
Yep. So this is so interesting because I talk to so many practices and they have the same false belief. We're going to annoy the hell out of them. We're not salespeople. We don't want to be pushy. They're bad leads. They didn't pick up. They didn't return my call. So, and I always go, yeah, that's interesting. That's how I behave too.
Yeah.
And, they kind of look at me and then I walk them through it. Have you ever clicked on anything where you really wanted it? You had good intentions or you were curious. Maybe even you didn't know you wanted to buy the alarm system, but you genuinely wanted to learn more. And then life happens and then your phone's ringing and you don't know the number. Well, I'm not picking up a number that's not saved in my phone. In fact, my phone doesn't even ring if the number's not saved. And I don't know how to change that setting. It kind of drives me crazy because the other day I was sending a wire and the bank had to call me and it locked my bank account because I didn't have the bank's number saved. Anyway, I don't check my voicemail. My phone just told me yesterday it was 100% full. I'm like, delete 10 so somebody else can leave me a voicemail. And then, how many times does that cycle have to play out? And I've gotten texts from people and I'm like, oh, that's them. Okay. But I'm busy. I'm like driving or I'm about to get on a Zoom call and this sometimes has happened for a year where I don't buy the thing that I wanted because I'm not dying. I don't have to have it. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, there are some people who have to have care, but there's a couple ways this plays out. One, you're in competition. Mm-hmm. So what if they called or opted into the first 3 rankings? And who's going to win that patient? Is it number 1 in the ranking? No, it's whoever has the best follow-up and service, because they could call somebody back and kind of not sound good on the phone and kind of tick the person off. And then the one in the 10th ranking or 5th ranking could call and they have great service. It's like, oh, well, I want to go there. So it's not just about even the follow-up and what we have to do there. It's how do we have to sound on the phone and what's the service need to look like? Then how do we actually get them to show up? Because now they may forget about their appointment. I've done that.
Yeah.
My chiropractor texts me, you have an appointment in 2 hours. And it's like this long text message. So I just glaze over it and don't even see who sent it or what it is. And then I get a text, you missed your appointment. Click here to reschedule. And I'm like, oh, that was the text. So there's all these things. And people's attention spans, I literally saw, there's a study on the internet, you can Google this. Our attention spans in some cases are shorter than a goldfish, and it's like the TikTok curse, on to
the next.
Yeah. And it's TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, text messages, emails. And there's just so much noise. So we have to think about that. And we have to put ourselves in there. That means empathy. I have to empathize with you and go, well, I mean, they did click on the ad. They probably want straight teeth if they have teeth. That's a whole different story. You know? And I'm just going to stay positive and keep following up with them to see, because they probably want help and we can help them. That's a whole different mindset than I called, left a voicemail, bad lead, another internet lead, you know, these crappy leads. And it's like, yeah, it's never going to be like your direct referrals. It just won't be, you know, but there are patterns and behaviors that most people have. If we take the time to think about it, we do it too. We do the same thing. So how do we have processes and systems that are geared towards consumer behavior, you know? And I would challenge people to think about it that way.
And I don't know if you notice this, but I definitely notice it in my practice. And I do it too. Like if I clicked on something and I changed my mind and they send me like a second text, I reply, stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the patients, like, I feel like the ones that actually clicked on it and they're like, okay, really, I'm not interested in.
They'll tell you.
They reply, stop.
Mm-hmm.
And then you stop reaching out. And because no one wants to be spammed with a bunch of, you know, calls or texts unless they actually, there's like some inkling of interest. But the ones that are like, okay, that was an accident, or I'm really not that interested now, or maybe they went some, who knows? But they tell you no, and then you just move on.
That doesn't mean to turn off all your automations, turn off your, or tell Sally not to text people that frequently because that person said stop. Simply means they weren't interested.
Right. Just that one person. And though I don't see those pop up that often, but it does happen. And I feel like those are the ones that, you know, decided they weren't interested anymore. And that's fine. Then you move on from that lead. But there's still hundreds of others that still are interested.
Exactly. And it's just a numbers game. We deal with the same thing at HIP. Obviously, we're selling to orthodontists and dentists. We get told, nope, wrong phone number. That's not me. But are you Dr. Kristen? Yep, click. You know what I mean? You know, HIP who, you know, they don't pick up. One time I tracked this guy because they didn't want to follow our process and they were complaining about it in bad leads. And I do this a lot of times. I went back to him and said, well, if you remember, and here's a video, I'll show him a video and scroll through it. We had to call you and text you 52 times over 4 years to get you on a call. Oh, yeah. Do you remember that? I do remember some of it. Yeah. I can't, you remember, you know, this person. And then it paints that picture of, again, oh yeah, I do that too. You know, so the thing to think about is you're building a pipeline of people, like you just said. There's going to be people who are not interested. There's going to be people who are interested. Some of these people you may help years from now. And that's why we do reactivation campaigns. But it's really about having a positive mindset. And in so many things, we're just negative because our brains are trained to look at what's wrong versus think about what's possible.
And I think that's where people go wrong, is like they hire you on and they don't get the team motivated the right way and explain like, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try this new process and we need to follow the steps that they tell us to do. And you've got to call them back. You've got to follow up with them. And they just go about it in a different way and wonder why it doesn't work. And then they want to get mad at you.
And go to the next thing.
Next one. Yeah. And it's just like a repeated cycle. And ultimately, I think that if you invest in good marketing and you follow the steps, like it really is a recipe for success. Like I think my practice shows that. I brought you on early on in the process, so it's not like I have this crazy baseline to go off of. But I do feel like for a practice that's 4.5 years old, like it's grown tremendously. And I 100% attribute a huge part of that to the partnership that I have with you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's been a good partnership. It's super exciting to continue to see you grow, and we've grown a lot together. So it's pretty cool.
I know. It's great to see. I remember you were just walking around with a backpack in 2018. There was no booth.
Yeah. No booth. There was a couple
no books,
team members, no books. Yeah. those were really exciting times, you know, because again, you're building it and you're like, man, is this going to work out? And it's cool to see the growth happen for sure. So exciting. And I kind of miss actually doing shows that way because I feel like you can connect with people better in a lot of ways versus having a booth, you know? So anyway, may go back to that.
Yeah.
See me at a AAO with a backpack.
With a backpack, just leaving the booth.
Yeah.
Or you can just venture out on your own and go talk to people.
True. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to Pensacola in studio and be on the podcast.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me.
Definitely.